Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about You Missed a Spot! And their 10th album, Oversteps. So, this is kind of a weird one to get to. After so many years of diving into the deepest recesses of experimental music and going out of their way to make the weirdest and most complex stuff they can, in a lot of ways you start to feel like there's nothing Autechre could do to surprise you anymore, unless perhaps they randomly decided that they were taking a break from that deep dive into experimentality by focusing an album more around, like, actual melodies and stuff. Which brings us to Oversteps, one of the weirdest entrants in their catalog on the merit of being one of their least weird. It's actually fairly accessible by their standards. No longer are they focusing on complex percussive rhythms or strange sound design. By this point, they're going for like a kind of ambient melodic project. Their most melodic project since Amber, and honestly probably even more so than even that one. Every track on here is very present melodies and chords forming more regular harmonies. In that way, this project can often be used as like an entry point to help people get into them in the first place. But even so, comparing this project to Amber is also not particularly accurate either. It does not sound like Amber much at all. Like, these melodies are so much more haunting and chilling and more upfront and taking up so much more of the mix. Amber feels more deserted and distant and subtle, while this one is aiming to envelop you so much more. And you know, I have often complained about this duo's previous stretches of albums going too far off the deep end for my tastes and kind of pushing me away, so of course an album like this in their catalog is much more likely to be up my usual alley. And yet somehow returning to it and examining it for this series, I'm less hot on it than I thought I was going to be. I mean, of course I'm all for this new direction and very much appreciate the fact that Autechre stepped back into an area of electronic music that wasn't quite as difficult to digest, even if they didn't stay there. But I don't know, Oversteps itself hasn't stuck out to me as much as one of their better projects. I mean, it's still good, it's a solid project, but it's far from great. Personal enjoyment-wise, it's about on par with Confield, albeit for very different reasons. The thing about Oversteps is that it's probably the one album of theirs that is most likely to blend together in a singular blur without me noticing like half the tracks in the bunch. And even if I do notice them, it feels like less than half of these really stick with me in the long term. It is certainly much more consistent than Confield on a personal enjoyment level, but it doesn't have nearly as strong standouts. There's no Seafern here, for instance. All the tracks on here are at least pretty good, but there's not much in the way that actually hits greatness, and it's still kind of an ephemeral experience, one that I feel like I have a lot less to say from an individual track basis. The complete opposite of Chorus, where each track had its own unique sound, and there were obviously a lot of them. That said, I do still quite like the mood and vibe this project creates. It's not quite like any other melodic ambient project I've heard. It's very intense and ghostly. Like the more melodic focus did not actually translate to being more pleasant, per se. It's an album that's very dark and dramatic all the way through. Not the kind of thing you listen to, you know, brighten your mood exactly. This is demonstrated right away with the opener, RS. These intense minor synth chords that just sound absolutely huge and monolithic, all that reverb to give it that very cold and windy vibe, while the percussion just kind of quietly pats along, not really forming into an obvious pulse, but still driving some momentum. It's like the exact opposite of something you'd find on Untilted. But that track is warm and comforting compared to the following track, Islanders, where the beats are all crunchy and distorted. It's got lots of harsh bassy synths, got airy pads around it that are much more atonal, but still has quite a few plinking melodies. This is a track that almost feels like demonic or something, and that vibe is matched in a very different way with the clanging synth harpsichords of Known One. That track admittedly has quite a few other screeching high-pitched leads later on that I found to be a bit grating, but I did eventually soften on them. This track is kind of like if one of the prepared piano pieces on Drux were given like a sense of monumental weight and importance and bombast. And, you know, I still probably prefer RDJ's more subtle approach to this kind of piece, but this one is a definite grower given how it's the only track on the album that really sounds like that. PT2PH8 does have a comparatively more chill and welcoming feel to its blends, letting these chords kind of melt into each other. That has a pretty cool effect. And the lack of percussion helps it become one of the more breathtakingly subtle moments on here. But then you got Q Play, a more beat-heavy track that feels like a less menacing and more abstract rehash of Islanders. I mean, it's cool, but it doesn't do much to set itself from the crowd. Thankfully, we're led into two of the best tracks in the bunch. C on C has all these harpsichord string-like synthleys playing around, although they don't have the same percussive texture that those on Known 1 do. These are much lighter and more delicate. Still easily fitting into that intense and dramatic atmosphere the rest of the album creates, but going about it in a much more subtle way. Definitely a consistent highlight. And then Treale. I feel like this is probably the most popular pick for best track on the project, and I'd probably have to agree. This track almost feels orchestral in its scope and the particular texture of its synth pads, but its mechanical melodies, buzzing bass, and slow building but regular 4/4 percussion make for a beautifully impressive mix that comes together in a totally effective way that I think any casual IDM listener would be able to get into. And it transitions pretty seamlessly into OS Vegas 3. Another more chill track with melodies that don't get too intense despite all the reverb, and a broken up abstract mechanical beat that kind of plunks and plods along, but still forms a regular pulse. I don't think this is the kind of track that I'd be able to recognize from a distance, and it does relatively closely mirror PT2 PH8, but at least it doesn't feel like a straight rehash to that track. It's just a similar mood created there. Then we get O = 0, which has all these chiming bell-like lead melodies that have a really distinctive and attention-grabbing texture that sticks out to me every time this track comes on, and it goes pretty nicely against the shuffling beats and other warbling and buzzing textures underneath it. Creates a really engaging mix, even if the blend can get kind of meandering and abstract in parts. That's definitely one of the most consistent highlights. And I do also really like d-sho Quub, even if it has a lot of squirting and plinking textures that often feel like they're just piled on top of each other in a heap and don't really sync up with each other. There is a pretty solid and hard-hitting beat that pops up, and some pads in the background that sound like a glitched-up male choir. It still definitely has enough compelling ideas in there to be one of my favorite beat-focused tracks in the bunch. Feels borderline epic. But as we go on from here, I start to really lose interest, and it feels like the project doesn't have much in the way of new ideas to show me. Saint Eprio, for instance, has a lot of squelching bass synths and distorted bursts of sparse percussion that kind of add up to a fairly unpleasant and harsh mix that never really seems to go anywhere. Redfall is nice, but it's also just kind of a less compelling rehash of C on C with the same plinky, delicate guitar harpsichord-like synths, airy pads, and a more present bass line that I suppose is trying to give it some more energy to set itself apart, but I don't know if that's enough. I mean, I do still enjoy it given it is a rehash of one of the best tracks on here, but it's not the most creative move they could have made at this point, you know. And Krylon is enjoyable in the same way as basically all the other tracks here, but it doesn't really do anything to set itself apart. It's got cool blends of plinky melodies, but so does pretty much every track that came before it. Kinda runs on a bit long too. And closer whaaaa, I guess it's got these plunking synths that start out kinda soft and muted, but progressively get sharper and harsher very quickly. You almost feel some of these synth pads like cut against you like razor blades, and some that almost sound like filtered trumpets. I suppose it's trying to close with the darkest and most intense moment of all, and you know, it at least is not a straight rehash of something else on here, but I also feel like a lot of these textures are clashing against each other so harshly they're actively cutting into each other and poking holes into the mix. It's clipping that hard in its most intense moments. I don't really know how to describe it. It's like trying to rub your hand against a cactus. Also, after all the textures melt away into an ambient pad at the end, it just kinda ends in a hard cut, which, really? But at least that's a closer that leaves an impact. I can see some people really loving this track and some people hating this one. I can't say I particularly enjoy it much myself, but my main problem with this project is the tracks that are just forgettable or redundant. And the closer is not that. It does feel like it has a purpose and context. But yeah, that's Oversteps. In one breath, this is one project that I absolutely would have given more of a pass to before I started work on this series, because I always used to think that Autechre so rarely included melodies or emotion in their projects, And this is a very sharp and obvious reminder that, yeah, of course that's still all there. And now it's here in the forefront in a more obvious way than any other project of theirs. But in a way, having finally grown to appreciate their more difficult projects like Confield and Draft and Untilted and get a better grasp on their appeal, regardless of my personal enjoyment, the simple fact that this project is so much more melody-focused than their usual fare isn't enough to just give a pass by itself anymore. I mean, of course I still like this project. I think it has a lot of really solid standouts that if I were to put them on out of context after one of their less melodic projects, it would totally blow me away. And, of course, that dark and dramatic mood this album creates is certainly well done across the board, and done in such a way that doesn't sound quite like any other project I've heard. I just don't think it's executed in as interesting a way as I would typically expect from these guys. More specifically, it's just their samiest project to date. The one where I have the hardest time telling tracks apart from each other. I mean, they would go on to make tracks in this style on later projects like Elsek. Like, the closer to that album, Onium, sounds a lot like the stuff from here, and it sticks out better because it's not surrounded by lots of other tracks that sound just like it. Variety is very important to me on any album, and this project doesn't have enough of it for me to consider it great. I mean, if you're gonna have a samey project like this to become a personal favorite, every track has to work and be memorable in its own right. You can't have filler. And Oversteps definitely has filler. There are a few tracks that you probably could just cut altogether without negatively affecting the project in any way. But I still will give it credit for being one of the most easily approachable projects from these guys. If you're more of a first-time Autechre listener, this is a good one to pick up. Like, it doesn't really prepare you for these guys at their most complex and experimental. If you want a more approachable project that can also prepare you for that, then I would more recommend LP5. But yeah, at the end of the day, Oversteps is a pretty good project. As I said in 2016, it's a melody-focused album. I missed those. And yeah, sure, that new focus came at the expense of a tighter or more well-executed album construction. It could have been done better, and it's probably in the lower half of my ranking of their albums, but melodic Autechre has been harder and harder to come by these days, and the standouts on this one still remind me of why I still pine for that side of them to come around more often. It's still a pretty solid album with ample reason to give it a shot, and I think I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review of something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.